Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing Monday edition. My name is Brian Calley, the CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. And I want to say thank you to our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. I encourage you to visit their website at consumerscu.org to learn more about them. So Brian, there's a new law that takes effect on Friday, June 30th, related to distracted driving. And a lot of jobs require driving. So can you tell us what's being prohibited?
Yeah, this distracted driving law is kind of a part two. I think of it as part two to what was already made illegal quite some time ago. It's been more than a decade that texting and driving has been illegal. So it was fairly limited. It was texting, not talking on the phone, holding the phone, using a phone for navigation, for example. It was just texting that was prohibited, and it was a secondary offense. In other words, a police officer couldn't pull you over for texting while driving. They had to have a different reason, and so it was not a primary offense, but it's called a secondary offense. In this case, though, first of all, it makes it primary. So if you're texting while driving or otherwise holding your phone while driving, and you're not doing anything else wrong, you can be pulled over for that. So it becomes a primary offense. Now, in terms of what's prohibited, everything. Holding your phone, just holding it, talking on it while you're driving, scrolling, typing, basically touching your phone while driving is illegal. So it's a pretty robust, I think, one of the more strict in the nation. And this, again, we're not talking about a proposed law. We're talking about something that's already in law, and it takes effect this Friday. So please be aware that this is something that they expect for people to go really to voice command type things. So you can use voice command. You can do talk to text if your phone can understand you, although I don't have a lot of luck with that. It sends all kinds of crazy stuff. So I tend to stay away from that. Maybe I need to enunciate better. But there are different things that you can do, but you can't be touching your phone. Think of it in those terms. Like, you just can't touch it. If you can tell it to call somebody and it goes over the speaker of your vehicle and you have a conversation that way, yes, you can do that sort of thing. If you can tell it to respond to a message or whatever without touching the phone, yes, you can do that. But if you have to touch the phone to do it, it is illegal.
Here in Ingham County, the sheriff's office actually put out a little video where he was driving around and said what you can and then, or what you can't and what you can do. So there are a few exceptions. Do you want to go over those?
Yeah, there are some exceptions when it comes to making an emergency call. So if you see an emergency and you call 911, that is allowed. If you see a crime, to report a crime taking place, that is another exception. Emergency responders, people like police officers and ambulance drivers, they're excluded from the law to the extent that they're using technology in order to fulfill the duties for the law. Same for utility workers, that in some cases, if using a device for the purposes of their job, then it can be made exempt, but very, very few exemptions.
So what are the penalties if we are caught holding our phone while driving?
Well, here's the thing. You don't know how strict it will be enforced, but I would expect that it probably will be enforced in a way that is going to be uncomfortable for people. And if you think that they can't see what you're doing in your car, or they're not going to notice or whatever, they do. This is something that they're trained on. In other states, really, officers have gotten quite good at spotting this. So what happens when you get caught? What happens when you get a ticket? So the first time you get a ticket, it is $100 fine and or 16 hours, up to 16 hours of community service. So this is different than like speeding ticket, a rolling stop. This is the sort of thing. It's treated more like almost. There's some. I'd hate to compare it to like drunk driving, but the idea that there's a potential requirement of your time to deal with the penalties. Something like community service. That it puts it at a different level than just like a speeding ticket. So that's first offense. And then $250 for every subsequent violation. So the first one is 100, 250 after that, and or 24 hours of community service. So this is I think the community service was a kind of a give, if you will, to some people. Maybe if they're low income, and what are you going to do if they can't pay the fine? You take away their driver's license. You might remember this thing called driver's responsibility fees from the Granholm administration, repealed under the Snyder administration, which put additional fines to balance the state's budget, but put additional fines on habitual bad drivers who got lots of tickets. The problem was that it took away driver's licenses from people, and it made it so they couldn't work, and so that cycle had to be broken. I think there was some concern that if you add something like this, it would create a scenario where people are low income, they can't pay their tickets, therefore they have to they'll maybe lose their license, they can't drive anymore, or lose their job, that sort of thing. That community service was meant to kind of speak to that and get that instead. Although I think community service is probably a pretty big lift for people that are scraping to get by and need the hours at work too. So, but I would just point out that potentially a ticket with this is not just like paying a ticket like you do with a speeding ticket. It potentially comes with community service requirements.
All right. And this law takes effect Friday, June 30th. So everyone be prepared. Let's switch to national politics. Michigan has had some attention from presidential candidates. So, Brian, give us your thoughts on presidential politics as it relates to Michigan.
Well, Michigan is already this far out shaping up to be a player. And part of that is because Michigan's presidential primary is likely to be moved up. So the legislature passed a law that moves Michigan's presidential primary very early in the process. That law did not get immediate effect, which means that it's not exactly clear how that's going to turn out. Because it moves it up so early in 2024, the presidential primary here, that if the bill does not get immediate effect, then it wouldn't take effect fast enough for that to come into being next year. So it's not exactly clear if our primary will be the normal time, which is kind of middle of the pack, or early because of this constitutional issue in Michigan law, which is whether a bill takes effect immediately as it's signed by the governor, or if it is in effect at some point in the future after the legislature adjourns that session for the year. That's kind of a technical issue, but it's really important on this one. On presidential primary, but all the candidates are looking at it like, wow, Michigan could be a really early state. So you see Biden paying attention. You see Trump was just here over the weekend. DeSantis was in the Midland area a few weeks ago. So there's a lot of attention already. Now, even if the presidential primary does not move up early and it stays at its normal place for this next cycle, even if that's the case, in the last two cycles, Michigan's presidential election has been relatively close, which means that Michigan and on the presidential politics level is seen as more of a swing state. So expect to see lots of attention on the state from the top tier candidates, the ones who have a legit shot at winning their party's nominations. They're going to be here in Michigan. I think that they'll be kind of regular fixtures. So we've seen that already. If you love politics, then it'll be an interesting time. And if you don't, well, Netflix usually doesn't have political ads on it.
All right. We've recently covered a lot of labor law changes and proposals, but they're not just related to business and cut across all sectors. Can you offer a high-level overview?
One of the things I know that our membership and we are very concerned about is this kind of onslaught of labor law changes. So whether it's local minimum wages or mandated paid sick leave or pay disclosure requirements, predictive scheduling, independent contractor restrictions, all of these things are really kind of coming to bear these proposals, pressure and uncertainty for the future. But the business community is actually not alone in trying to deal through all of this. And I don't expect that we'll have to stand alone in our advocacy efforts over the next legislative cycle. And that's because there are things being proposed both in schools and in healthcare and hospitals. So traditional either governmental aid units or local government units or nonprofits like most hospitals are. There are laws about staffing ratio changes in the midst of huge shortages, or in schools changes in terms of evaluation of staff, like to say that student performance couldn't be used as a factor in an evaluation of the staff of the school. These types of changes in laws that affect the relationship between the employer and the employee are showing up in a lot of different sectors. And so I think it's, on the one hand, it's, I guess, comforting to know that it's not just business that is facing these types of changes that would be hard to deal with should they come to fruition. But I also think that there'll be opportunities on certain issues for coalitions or alliances in advocacy efforts that don't normally play out. So as we look at issues that affect us, small business owners, as employers, these will be the sort of things that will affect other types of organizations as well. And so we're all about coalition. So as we move forward, each individual issue potentially has a different type of coalition. And I think it could cut across different sectors, not just the business community.
Okay, thanks for that update. Let's talk a little bit about the report that the Michigan retailers released actually just this morning, findings from their May Michigan Retailers Index survey.
Yeah, they put this out monthly, and as of really in fairly recent times, retailers have been pretty confident about the future. So there's the thing I like about the way the Michigan retailers, they have this index, and they talk to largely the same group of retailers. So you kind of see what's happening in comparing it to previous months is highly credible because it's not like a whole different group of retailers. And the May Retail Index survey came in at 50.7, and you don't have to necessarily know everything that goes into that particular index, but that's a decrease over April, which was 60.6. So that's a pretty big percentage decline. So to go from their overall index going from 60 down to 50, and then 39% of retailers reported sales increasing, 31% noted a decrease. So almost a third saw a decrease in sales in that month, which is it's just higher than recent experiences. But probably the most troubling out of the report is the future optimism. So this is one of the things that they traditionally ask every month, and 59% of retailers are predicting that their sales will rise through August, and that is down from a significant decline, down from 75% back in February that expected their sales to increase. So that it's just I guess a little bit of a surprise. They're after there are concerns of the economy slowing that have been here for a year, but retail sales have been pretty resilient in the face of all that. Although, as a practical matter, you see the monetary policy and kind of these dominoes that fall. Retail sales, I suppose it was always inevitable that there would be some kind of an impact, whether it's moderate or severe. But it looks to me like, at least in this last month, that there are more there's a kind of growing pessimism. And that pessimism comes from experience of April sales coming in at a pretty disappointing level.
All right, I guess I'll do some shopping, but it is a good reminder to, SBAM supports all small businesses, but we do have quite a few members in the retail industry, and supporting small business retailers is an easy way to ensure your dollar goes a lot farther in your community. So maybe do some shopping this week. Okay, Brian, so for today's Data Monday, you're going to take a deep dive into housing in Michigan. Yeah,
I want we haven't looked closely at housing in a little while, and it's kind of an interesting picture that we have. Let's start with what the expectations are on interest rates. So interest rates and housing highly correlated, and pretty interesting about what the market expected. So you see this tan line, the market expected interest rates to climb through late spring, so going back in February, and then start declining through the rest of the year. That's what early this year, the beginning of the year, the market expected rates to climb through late spring and then start dropping. Now the market expects that rates will actually continue to climb, kind of flatten out, but continue to climb a little bit higher. So another 0.25% or so increase over the summer and into the fall, and then stay there before starting to decline early next year. And so you see that kind of playing out in the interest rate market, that for a while you saw them kind of dropping down a little bit because the market was anticipating future rates to decline. Of course, at some point they will, but there's a largely expectation. The new and revised expectation for the market today is in blue. So compared to the beginning of the year, it's predicted to be significantly higher through spring of next year. Looking at existing one-home family sales in terms of the median price, I wanted to show this because it actually has gone into negative territory. And so before, when this number was dropping down in recent months, it was like, yeah, it's going down, but it's still above this zero line. That means that prices were still going up, even though they were going up at a smaller percentage. But overall, the average single-family home sale is down year over year, 3.4%. So that's significant. That feels pretty significant. Although I will say that there's reason to believe that it won't be that severe, because when we look at the houses, according to Redfin, that are facing bidding wars, it's at 46.7%. So almost half of houses that go for sale still have some competition, a bidding war to get that house. And while that's a lot less than the 70% that it was back in early 2022, and it was kind of approaching that point through 2021, so it's definitely lower, but still 46.7% of houses still facing a bidding war, or buyers facing a bidding war. So you see the median price has gone down, but half a house is still seeing that type of competition. Now, looking at the supply of home sales, while last month or the last quarter, that supply has up just a little bit. You'll notice on this chart that you'll see in the most recent time, that's up just a little bit, but still quite low in terms of the supply of houses on the market. That's why I believe that there's a limit to how low prices can go, because the supply is just so darn low. So even though the prices have started to go down somewhat, I don't think we should expect them to go down that much. And keep in mind, when you see year over year 3% down, that's 3% down from all-time highs. Okay, so it's not like in 2008, 2009. Existing home sales year over year. So this is just looking at the units that are selling, and in red you see what was happening during previous recessions. You'll see that this is really, really low. So this is the actual sales. This is an inventory. This is how many were for sale. But it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If the inventory is really low, then the number of houses selling are going to be low as well. And then looking at the refinances as a percentage of total applications. And you can see refinancing, as interest rates went up, refinancing fell way down. So of the total mortgages that are happening, which is a lot less than before, so it's a smaller pie. Of that pie, 26.9% made up of refinances. So most refinancing that happens is just somebody trying to get a better rate. Better rates aren't available. So now you're left with just a subset, those that need to pull equity out of a home, that are refinancing, that sort of thing. That's really what the market is left with today. And then the number of home sales has dropped, and it's in May, it's actually the lowest number of home sales on record. And again, it's not because houses aren't moving. It's because houses aren't being put up for sale in the first place. And then just looking at the U.S. Home purchase index, and you'll see that is, while it is kind of generally recovering a little bit, what that means is that it's declining at a slower rate than it was declining before. So overall, you see that softening in the housing market continue. And then I think the real story here is that the supply of houses is so darn low that it's affecting and so many things across the board. So you still see bidding wars even at a time when interest rates are high and the median price has fallen. It's just those market dynamics when there's a shortage, and it's the type of shortage where new housing stock doesn't just come online quickly. It's not like other types of commodities where there's shorter types of cycles. This is one that I can see it taking a generation really to move that needle.
Wow. Well, that was really interesting. So thanks for sharing that on today's Data Monday. That is the show for today. We will be back here Thursday at 3 p.m. Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody. See you on Thursday.